Are you someone who often finds yourself overcommitting and you take on more than you can manage and wind up overwhelmed and things start falling through the cracks? So, in an effort to change, you look at the advice that helps you, and it sounds something like this: start saying no more often, or protect your boundaries. Or you're afraid to say no, but every time you say yes to one thing, it's actually you saying no to another. Now, as an experienced overcommitter myself, that last one always lands and it feels very strong, but it doesn't always stick when I most need it. And in fact, there's a lot of really compelling advice that resonates strongly, but it doesn't necessarily lead to lasting change. And so today, that is what we're talking about. Like, what is going on with chronically overcommitting and what can you actually do about it? Now, first, let's start with what I mean when I talk about overcommitting. This is taking on more than you can realistically handle. And it's saying yes to things, whether that's to other people, but also to yourself. Now, you may lean heavily one way or another, maybe saying yes to other commitments and other people, or maybe you lean in the other direction where you just take on a lot yourself. But it's usually a combination of both internal and external commitments that we're taking on. So, what is the common advice? Usually it falls into two camps. The first I call practical tips, and the other is perspective shifts. And no, that was not an intentional rhyming, but they just happen to rhyme. So, practical tips are usually for both decision making, like don't commit until you check your calendar, or wait at least 24 hours before you say yes to anything. Now, there are also, though, practical tips for saying no if you are going to say no. Like, here are 10 ways to say no with grace. And these perspective shifts, the other category, they also help with decision making. Like, if it's not a hell yes, then it's a no. Or, what will you think about making this choice a year from now or 5 years from now? So these help with your decision making and help with your perspective. But they can also help you say no, like the one I shared at the start of, if you're afraid of saying no, and you say yes, you're actually still saying no to something else. So these are about shifting our perspective, our mindset, about either deciding whether you can take something on and also when it's time to say no, saying no, because those are two different parts of the overcommitting problem. Now, for a chronic overcommitter, I think it's really important to understand that this is multi layered. It can actually fall into all three types of roadblocks: logical, biological, and psychological. So, when we first look at the top level, this logical, it's when you maybe say yes without knowing where your time is really going. So, this is really practical. There is a gap between what you can do and what you say you can do, and how much time you actually have. And we could use a metaphor like it's like bringing new things into your home without checking to see if they fit first. And then all of a sudden, your house has too much stuff and you can't move around and you're overwhelmed. If we take a look next at biological. So, for biological challenges, this happens a lot depending on how you're wired, where maybe you're someone who you're constantly seeking novelty. You want to add new things to your plate, things that excite you. There are also people who have time blindness, where you genuinely do not have a good sense of how long things take. And so, although this is a practical thing, it is really about how you're wired in your brain, and it can make it challenging for you to truly make decisions based on how long things take. And then also there are our tendencies and how we react to other people asking things of us. For example, in the four tendencies framework, there's the obliger group, which is a really large group, who tend to say yes to external expectations. So they can honestly take on too much, or often they're the ones everyone goes to because they're probably going to say yes. And that's just how we're wired, is that if someone else asks us for something, we might be more likely to say yes than someone else who maybe has slightly just better boundaries naturally, where they're not inclined the same way. So it's all about how we're wired. Now, on the third level, this is psychological. This is a fear of what will happen if you say no, either to yourself or to other people. So there's a true worry that something bad might happen if I say no to this thing. And so you end up saying yes and you take on more than you should. Now, normally, when I am talking about the three types of roadblocks, I typically suggest start with logical first. Just make sure that you've already addressed those gaps because sometimes that's the true gap. And once you solve that, you'll actually be fine. However, when it comes to this being a pattern, if you are finding yourself overcommitting over and over and over again, I actually think you should tackle the psychological roadblock first. It takes the most work, but it's actually the most enduring. And as long as if you only focus on logical or even biological, you're still going to find yourself, if you haven't shifted your mindset, you will keep falling into that same trap. So, how do you actually do that? Well, when it comes to a psychological roadblock, it's about working on your mindset and getting curious about why you are hesitating. So instead of just looking at advice that's trying to shift your perspective and other ways of seeing it, you actually want to ask yourself questions about what's the fear? What is the thing I'm trying to avoid? And so let's start with an example of saying no to yourself. And this is something I struggle with. So there is something that you genuinely want to do, but you know that you risk overcommitting yourself if you say yes to it. So asking yourself the question, what are you worried will happen if you say no to yourself? Will saying no mean that you are stuck in a rut, or that you are boring, or that you're trapped, or maybe you're missing out, or maybe that you'll feel resentful if you say no? Now, I know personally for me, I hate the idea of feeling trapped or restricted. I have a very high value on freedom and I like to follow my curiosity. I am also someone who is impulsive and I get excited about new opportunities. So whenever I feel like I can't pursue a new interest, it's like my freedom is being limited, or at least it feels that way. So I have this sort of underlying assumption that not being able to do new things means that I lack freedom. So I've made this connection in my brain that if you have to say no, it means you don't have freedom. And saying no to something that I want to do, it feels like I'm confined or I am restrained. And I don't like that feeling. So I want to avoid that feeling at all costs. Now, knowing that I think this way helps me to see why I hesitate to say no to something new, especially if it's exciting. But uncovering why I do that is just the first step. The next step is to actually challenge this assumption that saying no means I don't have freedom. Because when I really look at that statement, I start to see the flaws that being overcommitted, stressed, and dropping the ball, that actually doesn't feel like freedom at all. And actually, it feels like I am not in control and I feel like I'm trapped by taking on more than I can handle. I actually have freedom to say yes to things, but I can't change how much time is in the day. So, freedom to say yes means I also need to say no to something else to make room for it. And I do have the freedom to do that. I just have to be willing to make that trade off. That's a choice, and making a choice is a form of freedom. And as I start to poke holes in these assumptions, this initial assumption that saying no means you don't have freedom, it means that I can challenge it and I can challenge it in real life. So, can I say no to something, either the new thing, or I could say no to an old thing to make room for this new thing and just pay attention to how I really feel? Do I honestly feel like I am trapped or confined or restricted or not? Now, I want to give a little shout out that I've made progress on this area, this mindset, with especially with the help of Oliver Berkman. So he's an author of the book 4,000 Weeks, Meditation for Mortals, and his work about the importance of accepting the limits on our time has been extremely helpful for me. And I know there might be other people you found helpful for kind of embracing that we do have limits and that it's actually freedom when you embrace it and say, you know what, I only have so many hours in the day. I can't do everything I want to do. And if there's someone else you recommend, I would love to know in the comments. Now, Let's turn to an external example. So, saying no to someone else. What is the worry that happens or that comes up when you imagine saying no? For example, maybe you're afraid that you will hurt someone's feelings, that you might damage a relationship, that you might risk your job or your future in a job. You might be perceived as not being a team player or not contributing as much as other people. Or you might feel like you are missing out on an opportunity and you might regret it. So let's take an example and imagine that you are invited to collaborate on a project. And it's an honor to be invited to this, even though it would mean that saying yes overextends yourself. When you imagine saying no and you notice what worries emerge, you realize that you are concerned that saying no means you might not be asked again and that you have potentially ruined future chances of collaborating. Now, why might you think this? Maybe you have an assumption that you really only get one chance like this, that saying no now means that you won't ever be interested again, or that saying no signals that you aren't a team player or don't want to take on extra projects like this. But we have to ask, is this true? And can we think of other examples, either in your life or other people you know, that contradict this assumption that you really only get one chance? When you start to poke holes in your assumptions, that's when you start to release their hold over you and over your decision making. Now, one of the tricks that I recommend for this is to think of someone else that you know or know of who says no comfortably in a situation like this and ask yourself, what do they believe that's different from me? How are they looking at the world where they don't see the same threats and worries that I do? And then, can I try acting like them and see what happens? This mindset work, it takes time and it gets better with experience. It's good to start safely, like maybe saying no to something that there's lower risk involved or the lower stakes that are involved. But the more that you start to poke holes in your assumptions and start to prove them wrong, then the less control they have over you because you're starting to realize that it's not a fact that if I do this, then this negative thing will happen. And the mindset work itself actually looks like embracing all of the practical advice about how to make decisions and how to say no. You actually want to practice doing those things that people advise, but in this case, when you do it, you aren't just following the advice, you are following the advice and paying attention to what happens when you do. Do any of the things that you were worried about happening actually happen? And even if they do happen, are you still okay at the end of it? And we can only do this through experience. We can only learn if our assumptions are false through experience. Because when you get free of these unhelpful assumptions and you've actually seen in real life that these assumptions aren't true, or at least they're not fully true, and these fears, they'll stop holding you back in the same way. And once that happens, that is when you'll find your momentum and keep it.